The scorching desert sun cast long shadows across the worn felt of the poker table as Jake Miller studied his cards with practiced indifference. The saloon in Silver City had grown quiet, save for the occasional clink of glasses and nervous shuffling of the other players. Jake had been working these frontier gambling halls for 15 years, reading men's souls in the twitch of an eye or the tremor of a hand. But something about tonight felt different. Across the table sat William Thompson, a cattle baron whose weathered face bore the harsh lines of a man accustomed to getting his way. His ranch had been bleeding money for months, and desperation had driven him to this high-stakes game. Between them lay a deed to Thompson's supposedly worthless tract of land. 5,000 acres of sun-baked earth that no one had managed to work successfully. Jake watched as Thompson's fingers drummed against the table, a tell he'd picked up on hours ago. The other players had long since folded, leaving just the two of them locked in this final hand. The pile of coins and bills at the center seemed almost insignificant compared to that yellowed piece of paper that could change everything, or nothing at all. "Call," Jake said softly, laying down his cards with the same careful precision he'd used to build his reputation. Four kings stared up at the oil lamps swaying overhead. Thompson's face crumpled as he slapped down his full house, queens over tens. Without a word, he shoved back his chair and stormed out into the night, leaving behind the deed that had been in his family for 3 generations. The saloon's other patrons drifted away as Jake sat alone, studying the document by lamplight. The property lay 20 miles south of Silver City, straddling the old Spanish mission trail. He'd heard rumors about the land, that it was cursed, that the soil was poisoned, that the Spanish priests had buried their treasures there centuries ago. But Jake had learned long ago that rumors were like desert mirages, beautiful, compelling, and usually empty. Dawn found him riding south, his stallion's hooves kicking up clouds of dust that hung in the still morning air. The terrain grew increasingly rugged as he followed the crude map sketched on the back of the deed. Thorny mesquite and twisted Joshua trees dotted the landscape, their shadows stretching like grasping fingers across the rocky ground. A raven wheeled overhead, its harsh cry echoing off distant cliffs. The first surprise came when he crested a rise and saw the mission below. Unlike the ruined heap he'd expected, Santa Rosa de Lima stood proud against the backdrop of red stone cliffs. Its adobe walls glowed golden in the morning light, and its bell tower reached toward the cloudless sky like a finger pointing to heaven. More surprising were the signs of life, smoke rising from several chimneys, washing strung between posts, the distant sound of children's voices. A figure emerged from the mission's heavy wooden doors, a priest in a black cassock, walking with purpose toward Jake. Even at this distance, there was something commanding about his bearing. As Jake drew closer, he could see the man was younger than most frontier priests, perhaps 40, with intense dark eyes and an expression that suggested he'd been expecting this visit. "I am Father Samuel Davis," the priest said, without preamble as Jake dismounted. "And you must be the gambler who won William Thompson's deed. I've been dreading this day." His accent carried traces of both Mexico City refinement and frontier pragmatism. Behind him, several Mexican workers had appeared, watching the exchange with undisguised hostility. Jake's hand instinctively moved closer to his holster, but he kept his voice casual. "The deed's legal, Padre. Won fair and square." The priest's smile held no warmth. "Perhaps by man's law, Mr. Miller. But this land was consecrated to God's service 300 years ago. The Thompson family understood that. They left us in peace to do the Lord's work. I pray you'll show the same wisdom." As if to underscore the priest's words, the mission's bell began to toll, its deep voice rolling across the desert. Jake noticed more workers emerging from adobe buildings scattered around the mission proper. Their faces were grim, their hands calloused from work, and some of those hands rested near hidden weapons. The simple property dispute he'd expected was rapidly becoming something far more complicated. The smell of silver hit him the moment he stepped into the cool darkness of the mission. Jake had spent enough time in mining camps to recognize the distinctive mineral tang that clung to stone and timber. Beneath the pious veneer of crosses and candles, this was no ordinary church. The priest's determination to protect the land suddenly made much more sense, though Jake suspected there was still more to the story than mere material wealth. Jake ran his fingers along the rough stone wall, following the silver's scent deeper into the mission's shadowy interior. Decades of incense and candle smoke had darkened the ceiling, but couldn't mask the telltale mineral presence. His gambler's instincts, honed through years of reading tells across poker tables from Abilene to Tombstone, screamed that he'd stumbled onto something far bigger than a simple land dispute. The priest's footsteps echoed behind him, sandals scraping against worn flagstones. The mission's treasures aren't meant for personal gain, Mr. Hawkins. These artifacts, this land, they belong to the people who've worked it for generations. The Thompson family understood that balance. They protected both the silver and the sacred. A shaft of dusty sunlight pierced through a high window, illuminating an ornate silver crucifix mounted on the wall. The craftsmanship was exquisite, clearly Spanish colonial work from centuries past. Jake had seen enough stolen goods in his checkered career to recognize its value would fetch a small fortune in Silver City's antiquities market. I respect tradition, Father, but that deed's legal. One fair and square from William Thompson himself. Jake turned to face the priest, noting how the older man's shoulders had tensed. Though I'm curious why a man would gamble away land this valuable, unless he knew something about its true ownership that made him want to wash his hands of it. The priest's weathered face remained impassive, but Jake caught the slight twitch at the corner of his mouth. There was definitely more to the story. Outside, the workers were gathering in larger numbers, their murmured Spanish carrying through the thick adobe walls. The situation was becoming powder keg dangerous. Perhaps we could reach an arrangement, Jake offered, surprising himself with the sincerity in his voice. His younger self would have already been plotting how to strip the place bare and disappear into the desert night. But he'd grown tired of always taking the easy, crooked path. I've got no interest in disrupting the mission's work. Maybe there's a way we can all benefit while preserving what matters. The priest studied him for a long moment, dark eyes searching for deception. There's someone you should meet first. Someone who might help you understand what's truly at stake. He gestured toward a heavy wooden door set deep in the mission wall. The Thompson family's matriarch, Catherine. She's lived here longer than anyone, watching over both the silver and the sacred artifacts. Her blessing carries more weight than any deed. Jake followed the priest through the door and down a narrow corridor lit by sputtering oil lamps. The silver smell grew stronger, mixing with the musty scent of age and earth. They emerged into a small courtyard where an elderly woman sat in a rocking chair, her silver hair gleaming in the late afternoon sun. She smiled as they approached, but her eyes were sharp and alert. "So you're the gambler who won our troublesome deed," Catherine Thompson said, her voice surprisingly strong. "William was a fool to wager it, though perhaps the Lord works in mysterious ways. Tell me, Mr. Hawkins, what do you see when you look at this place? Silver? Artifacts to be sold? Or something worth more than mere wealth?" The question caught Jake off guard. He'd come expecting to find either worthless desert or exploitable resources. Instead, he'd stumbled into a complex web of history, faith, and community that defied simple solutions. For the first time in years, the practiced charm and easy lies of the professional gambler failed him. Catherine Thompson deserved an honest answer. He just wasn't sure what that answer was yet. Jake shifted his weight, the weathered boards of the mission's courtyard creaking beneath his boots. The desert wind whispered through the adobe walls, carrying the faint chime of distant chapel bells. Catherine Thompson's question hung in the air like the heat waves that shimmered above the sand, a challenge to everything he thought he knew about this venture. "Ma'am, I've spent my life reading tells at poker tables, not searching for deeper meanings," he finally said, removing his hat and running a hand through his dust-streaked hair. "But I can tell you this place isn't what I expected. There's something here that doesn't fit neatly into a deed or a mining claim." Catherine nodded slowly, her rocking chair casting rhythmic shadows across the sun-baked courtyard tiles. The Spanish fathers who built this place understood that. So did the Mexican families who've worked this land for generations. Even William, for all his faults, knew there was more here than silver in the ground. A young Mexican worker hurried into the courtyard, speaking rapidly to Catherine in Spanish. She raised a weathered hand to quiet him, then turned back to Jake. "Father Thomas has called a meeting at the chapel. It seems word of your deed has spread quickly. Perhaps you'd care to join us, Mr. Hawkins? See what you've truly won in that game?" Jake followed Catherine through the mission's shadowed corridors, past crumbling frescoes of saints and martyrs. The chapel ahead buzzed with voices, a mix of English and Spanish floating through its ancient doors. He recognized several faces from Silver City's saloons, men who'd watched him win the deed from William with barely concealed interest. The conversations died as Jake entered. Jake Miller stared at the deed in his trembling hands as his horse picked its way through the sun-bleached rocks outside Silver City. The parchment felt like it was burning his fingers, not from the merciless New Mexico heat, but from the weight of what it represented. He'd won it fair and square in that smoke-filled saloon 3 nights ago, though fair was a relative term when it came to his particular card-playing talents. The supposedly worthless Thompson Ranch sprawled across 5,000 acres of desert, its boundaries marked by towering red rock formations that resembled ancient cathedral spires. As Jake approached the main house, he noticed the careful stonework of the walls, far too precise for typical ranch construction. The building had an odd layout, too, more like a church than a homestead, with high, narrow windows and a bell tower rising from one end. Father Samuel Davis watched the strangers approach from the mission's shaded portico, his weathered face creased with concern. The gambler's arrival was exactly what he'd feared since Old Man Thompson's death 2 months ago. The priest had spent 30 years protecting the mission's secrets, preserving both its physical treasures and the dignity of the Mexican families who had lived and worked here for generations. Jake dismounted at the hitching post, squinting at the silent Mexican workers who had stopped their tasks to watch him. Their faces were unreadable, but their body language spoke volumes. These people viewed him as an intruder. A young woman named Sarah Thompson emerged from the building, her black mourning dress a stark contrast to the whitewashed walls. She was the former owner's daughter, and her eyes held both grief and defiance. "I know why you're here, Mr. Miller," Sarah said, her voice steady despite her obvious distress. "My father's gambling debts. But this land isn't just a ranch, it's sacred ground. These people have lived here since before the American border existed. Their ancestors are buried in the mission cemetery. You can't simply take it from them." Father Samuel placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. Jake's carefully constructed world of easy marks and calculated risks began to crumble as he looked around. The mission's bell tower cast a long shadow across the courtyard, where clay pots overflowed with bright flowers despite the harsh climate. An elderly woman was teaching children their letters in the shade of an ancient mesquite tree. This wasn't just property to be won or lost. It was a living community. The priest led Jake on a tour of the grounds, explaining the mission's history. Founded in 1692, it had survived Apache raids, revolution, and the harsh desert itself. But its true significance lay hidden beneath the chapel floor. A vast collection of priceless religious artifacts rescued from Spanish missions during Mexico's anti-clerical persecution of the 1920s. Father Samuel had devoted his life to protecting both the treasures and the families who guarded them. William Wilson, Silver City's most prominent banker, arrived unexpectedly during Jake's tour. His expensive suit seemed out of place in the dusty courtyard. "Miller," he said with false warmth, "I'm prepared to offer you 10 times what Thompson owed for that deed. Cash, right now." The banker's eyes kept straying to the mission's weathered walls, and Jake recognized the predatory gleam of a man who knew something valuable was hidden nearby. The Mexican workers gathered silently as Wilson made his offer, their faces hard with determination. Jake noticed several were armed, though they made no threatening moves. Elizabeth Martinez, the mission's elderly cook, stepped forward and spoke in accented English. "This land was given to our people by the Spanish crown. No deed that passes between gamblers can change that. We will defend our home." As night fell, Jake sat alone in what had been Thompson's study, examining faded documents by lamplight. The legal ownership was clear. He held valid title to the land. But the moral question weighed heavily. He had spent his life taking advantage of others' weaknesses, viewing everything as a game to be won. For the first time, he faced the human cost of his choices. Outside, he could hear the mission's bell tolling for evening prayers. The sound of hoofbeats in the distance drew Jake to the window. Through the deepening twilight, he could make out riders approaching from the direction of Silver City. At least 6 men, led by Wilson. The gambler's instincts that had served him well at countless poker tables now screamed danger. He quickly gathered the documents and slipped them into his saddlebags. Moving through the mission's shadowed corridors, Jake found Elizabeth lighting candles in the chapel. "Wilson's coming back and he's not alone," he warned. The elderly woman showed no surprise, merely nodding as she continued her task. We knew he would return. The people are ready. Her calm certainty made Jake uncomfortable. He wasn't used to those who faced conflict with prayer rather than guns. In the courtyard, the Mexican workers were already gathering, armed with tools and old rifles. Jake recognized the quiet dignity in their bearing. These weren't frightened peasants but men defending their home. Several carried torches, the flickering light casting dramatic shadows against the adobe walls. A young man named Samuel, who Jake had seen tending the mission's small herd of cattle, took position near the gate with a weathered Winchester. The riders drew closer, and Jake could now see that Wilson had brought muscle from the Silver City saloons, hard men who'd kill for a price. The sound of the mission bell ceased, leaving an ominous silence broken only by the approaching horses. Jake's hand instinctively moved to his gun, then stopped. For the first time in his life, he questioned whether violence was the answer. Elizabeth emerged from the chapel, a wooden cross held before her like a shield. The other women of the mission gathered behind her, including Mary, the young seamstress who had been teaching Jake Spanish words during his meals. Their quiet prayers in mixed Spanish and English filled the courtyard. Jake felt a strange stirring in his chest. These people had something worth more than silver or artifacts. Wilson reined his horse to a stop outside the gate, his men spreading out in a threatening half-circle. "Last chance, friend," he called to Jake. "Take my offer and walk away rich. Otherwise, things might get messy." The gambler's voice was friendly, but his eyes were cold. Jake had seen that look across poker tables just before the shooting started. The mission's defenders remained silent, waiting. Jake stepped forward, positioning himself between Wilson's men and the gate. "The land's not for sale," he said firmly. "These people have worked it for generations. Their claim goes deeper than any paper deed." The words surprised him even as he spoke them. When had he started caring about justice more than profit? Wilson's smile vanished. "Don't be a fool, Jake. You're a gambler, not some holy man. Think about the silver under this worthless dirt. Think about those Spanish treasures gathering dust in there. We could both walk away wealthy men." His men shifted restlessly, hands near their weapons. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Behind Jake, Samuel quietly worked the lever of his Winchester, chambering around. The sound echoed in the gathering darkness. Elizabeth's prayers grew louder, joined by more voices. Jake realized he had to make a choice: continue his life of taking advantage of others, or finally stand for something larger than himself. The silver moon rose over the desert, casting everything in pale light. Jake thought of all the games he'd won, all the men he'd cheated, all the lives he'd potentially ruined. The weight of those choices seemed to press down on him, like the heavy Mexican heat. Here was a chance to change that pattern, to defend something genuine and sacred. "I've made my decision," Jake announced, his voice carrying across the tense courtyard. "The mission stays with its people. If you want it, Wilson, you'll have to take it by force." He drew his gun slowly, deliberately, making his intention clear. "And I promise you, that won't be easy." The choice felt right, like finally laying down a winning hand after hours of bluffing. Wilson's men shifted uneasily in their saddles, the moonlight glinting off their Winchester rifles. The old prospector Samuel, who had been silently watching from the mission's stone archway, stepped forward with surprising authority. "Jake's right. This land ain't just about silver or Spanish treasures. These people have worked it for generations. Their blood and faith are mixed with this soil." The tension crackled like heat lightning across the desert night. Elizabeth emerged from the chapel, carrying an ancient wooden cross that seemed to glow in the pale light. The Mexican workers, armed with tools and determination, formed a line behind Jake and Samuel. Wilson's face twisted with rage, but uncertainty flickered in his eyes as he counted the growing opposition. "You're making a mistake, Jake," Wilson spat. "I've got friends in Silver City who won't take kindly to this interference. That deed you won might have been legal in Tombstone, but papers can burn and memories can be adjusted." His horse pawed nervously at the ground, sensing the building confrontation. Jake holstered his gun slowly, a move that surprised everyone. "Wilson, I've spent my life reading men across poker tables. Right now, you're holding a weak hand and bluffing hard. Those men behind you? They're hired guns, not true believers. They don't care about your claims or your ambitions. But these people," he gestured to the mission's defenders, "they're fighting for their homes, their heritage. The desert wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and approaching rain. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and Samuel's weathered face broke into a knowing smile. "Storm's coming," he said quietly. "Desert storms have a way of washing things clean, showing what's truly valuable." Elizabeth stepped closer to Jake, her presence both calming and strengthening. "There's a chamber beneath the mission," she whispered. "The old Padres built it to protect their treasures from raiders." Jake Miller stood at the entrance of the ancient Spanish mission as the desert wind howled through its weathered stone archways. The setting sun cast long shadows across the courtyard, where Father Samuel Thompson and 24 Mexican workers had gathered, their faces resolute with determination. The old priest's weathered hands gripped a wooden cross as he faced the gambler who had won their sacred ground in a game of chance. Behind Jake, William Davis and his band of hired guns shifted nervously, their fingers hovering near their holsters. "This land belongs to God and his people," Father Samuel declared, his voice carrying across the mission's dusty courtyard. "No piece of paper from a poker table can change that truth." The workers murmured in agreement, some clutching farm tools that could easily become weapons. Jake felt the weight of the deed in his breast pocket, along with the crushing burden of his past sins. He had come to Silver City seeking one last score before retiring, but fate had dealt him an unexpected hand. The silver mine's entrance gaped like a dark wound in the hillside behind the mission, its timber supports creaking in the wind. Jake had discovered it purely by accident while exploring his newly won property, hidden behind a collapsed section of the mission's original wall. The ore samples he'd had tested in town confirmed it was worth a fortune. But as he'd learned more about the mission's history and the community it served, the gambler found himself increasingly troubled by conscience. Sarah Wilson, the local schoolteacher who had been helping Father Samuel preserve the mission's artifacts, stepped forward from the crowd. Her green eyes met Jake's with a mixture of disappointment and hope. Over the past weeks, as she had shown him the mission's carefully cataloged treasures and shared stories of its significance to the local people, something had shifted in Jake's hardened heart. He found himself wanting to be worthy of her respect. "These people have nothing else," Sarah said softly, though her words carried clearly in the tense silence. "This mission is their anchor, their history, their future. The silver beneath our feet means nothing compared to what this place means to them." Jake noticed how the workers straightened with pride at her words, and how Father Samuel's eyes shone with gratitude. The old priest had spent 30 years building this community from nothing. William Davis spat into the dust. "Don't go soft now, Miller. We had a deal. You get the deed, I provide the muscle to clear out these squatters, and we split the silver 50-50. These people can pray somewhere else." His men murmured in agreement, but Jake detected uncertainty in some of their faces. They hadn't signed up for driving people from their church. The mission's bell began to toll, though no one was pulling its rope. The sound echoed off the ancient walls as the wind picked up, carrying the scents of sage and creosote. Jake remembered the stories Sarah had told him about the Spanish priests who had first built this place, how they had died protecting their indigenous converts from raiders. Their bones still lay beneath the chapel floor, their sacrifice embedded in the very stones. "I've spent my life taking what wasn't mine," Jake said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "Winning other men's money, their properties, their hopes, all with marked cards and loaded dice. I told myself it was just business, that they knew the risks when they sat down to play." He pulled the deed from his pocket, holding it up so it caught the last rays of sunlight. The paper fluttered like a wounded bird. Father Samuel stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Jake's face rather than the document. "It is never too late to choose a different path, my son. God's grace can transform even the hardest heart." The old priest's words struck Jake like physical blows, reminding him of his own father, a minister who had died ashamed of his only son's choices. Behind him, William Davis cursed and drew his pistol. The next few moments passed in a blur of motion and sound. Davis's shot went wide as Jake tackled him, sending them both rolling in the dust. The workers surged forward with their tools raised, while Davis's men scattered rather than face the angry mob. Sarah's scream pierced the chaos as more shots rang out. But when the dust settled, it was William Davis who lay bleeding from wounds inflicted by his own men's wild firing. "Get him to the doctor in Silver City," Jake ordered, helping Davis's former men lift their wounded boss. "Tell him Jake Miller will pay the bill." He turned to Father Samuel, who was already organizing some workers to ride with the injured man. And then come back here tomorrow. We have a mission to restore. He held out the deed to the priest, but Samuel Thompson shook his head with a gentle smile. Keep it for now, the priest said. Show us that your conversion is sincere by using your skills to help us protect this place legally. These people will need a strong advocate in the territorial courts. Jake nodded slowly, understanding that redemption would require more than a single generous gesture. Sarah's hand slipped into his, and for the first time in years he felt truly wealthy. As night fell over the mission, the sound of grateful prayers mixed with songs of celebration. Jake Miller sat in the chapel's back pew, the deed still in his pocket, watching candlelight dance across ancient murals. Sarah brought him a plate of food and sat beside him in comfortable silence. Outside, the desert wind continued to blow, but it no longer seemed to howl. Instead, it whispered of second chances and the mysterious ways that grace could transform a soul. The next morning brought new challenges as riders appeared on the horizon, kicking up dust clouds that shimmered in the desert heat. Jake recognized William Henderson's men from the Silver City Mining Consortium, their approach carrying the weight of inevitable confrontation. He stood on the mission's worn steps beside Father Samuel, both men watching the riders draw closer while Sarah organized the local families inside the chapel. The sound of hooves grew louder as 12 mounted men fanned out across the mission's courtyard. William himself sat astride a black stallion, his face twisted with barely contained rage as he surveyed the scene. Behind him, Thomas Reed, the territorial marshal who'd always seemed to be in William's pocket, adjusted his badge with calculated menace. The morning sun cast long shadows across the adobe walls as both sides measured each other in tense silence. That deed was obtained through fraud, Miller, William called out, his voice carrying across the courtyard. My lawyers have already filed papers in Silver City. This land and everything on it belongs to the mining consortium. Jake felt Father Samuel tense beside him, but the priest remained silent, his weathered hands clasped before him in quiet prayer. The families inside the chapel began singing hymns in Spanish, their voices drifting through the morning air like incense. Jake stepped forward, keeping his hands visible and away from his holster. The game was fair, Henderson. You know it, I know it, and every man at that table knows it. But this isn't about the deed anymore. He gestured to the mission behind him. This is holy ground, and these people have worked this land for generations. Your silver can wait. The miners shifted uncomfortably in their saddles, several crossing themselves at the mention of holy ground. Marshal Thomas spurred his horse forward. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Jake. You've got a reputation for being reasonable. Take whatever Henderson's offering and walk away. But Jake could see something had changed in the marshal's eyes. A flicker of doubt as he looked at the mission's cross silhouetted against the morning sky. The law might be on William's side, but God's law carried its own weight in these territories. Sarah emerged from the chapel then, carrying an ancient leather-bound book. She opened it carefully, revealing carefully preserved records dating back to Spanish colonial times. These documents prove the mission's claim predates any mining rights, she announced, her voice clear and confident. The territorial governor in Santa Fe will be very interested to see them. Jake smiled, remembering why he'd fallen for her sharp mind as much as her kind heart. William's face darkened as he realized his position weakening. Several of his men had already removed their hats, unable to meet the eyes of the families now gathering in the doorway of their church. The mining consortium leader made one final attempt, reaching into his vest to pull out a bank draft. Name your price, Miller. Everyone has one. The paper fluttered in the hot desert wind like a surrender flag. Jake looked at Father Samuel, who nodded almost imperceptibly. You're right, Henderson. Everyone does have a price. He walked forward, took the bank draft, and tore it in half. Mine is redemption. The torn pieces scattered across the courtyard as William's men began turning their horses, one by one, unable to stomach forcing families from consecrated ground. Their boss sat alone, power slipping away like water in the desert sand. As William Henderson finally turned his horse to leave, Father Samuel stepped forward. Mr. Henderson, he called out, his voice gentle but carrying authority. You're welcome to join us for Mass. God's house is open to all who seek him. The mining magnate stiffened but didn't respond, spurring his horse toward Silver City. Marshal Thomas lingered behind, removing his badge to polish it thoughtfully before pinning it back on at a slightly different angle. The families emerged fully from the chapel now, children running to collect the scattered pieces of the bank draft like fallen leaves. Jake watched them play as Sarah leaned against his shoulder, her presence as steady as the mission's ancient walls. He realized that winning the deed had been no accident. Perhaps God's grace worked through even a gambler's hands to achieve its purpose. The silver in the ground could wait. The real treasure was already above it, in the hearts and faith of those who called this sacred place home. Father Samuel gathered everyone for morning prayers, his voice carrying across the courtyard where, moments before, conflict had seemed inevitable. Jake knelt beside Sarah, feeling the rough stones beneath his knees and the warm sun on his back. For the first time in his life, he understood that some bets were made not at the poker table, but in the quiet moments when a man chose between what was profitable and what was right. Jake Miller stood at the entrance of the silver mine, watching the last rays of sunlight paint the desert hills in shades of crimson and gold. The past week's events had shaken his world to its core, forcing him to question everything he thought he knew about himself. The deed to the ranch sat heavy in his vest pocket, won fair and square in that fateful poker game. But the weight of Father Samuel's words weighed even heavier on his conscience. The priest's impassioned plea still echoed in his mind. This land was consecrated to God's service centuries ago by Spanish missionaries who gave their lives to bring His word to these harsh lands. The silver beneath our feet matters not. What matters are the souls of those who work this earth. The Mexican workers had stood behind Father Samuel, their faces resolute, ready to defend what they saw as sacred ground. Catherine Thompson, the local schoolteacher who had helped Jake understand the historical significance of the ancient mission, approached him now. Her presence had become a steady comfort during these troubled days. "Have you made your decision?" she asked softly, her eyes reflecting the dying light. Jake turned to face her, seeing in her expression the same quiet wisdom that had first drawn him to seek her counsel. "I've spent my life taking what I could get, Catherine. Cards, cons, whatever scheme promised the quickest profit," Jake admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "But standing here, seeing what this place means to these people, it's changed something in me. I can't be the man I was anymore." He pulled the deed from his pocket, turning the weathered paper in his hands. The sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Father Samuel rode at the head of a small group, including William Davis, the former owner who had lost the ranch to Jake, and James Wilson, the Silver City banker who had been pressuring to buy the mining rights. Jake straightened his shoulders, knowing the moment of truth had arrived. "I've made my decision," Jake announced as the men dismounted. "The mission and its grounds will be returned to the church, with a legal trust ensuring it remains so in perpetuity." Father Samuel's eyes widened in surprise, but Jake wasn't finished. "The silver mine will be operated as a cooperative, with profits shared among the workers who have tended this land for generations." William Davis stepped forward, his face dark with anger. "You can't do this, Miller. That silver mine is worth a fortune." James Wilson nodded in agreement, but Jake held up his hand to silence them. "I've already drawn up the papers with help from Catherine and some legal minds in town. It's done." The setting sun caught the silver cross atop the old mission, making it gleam like a beacon. The transformation in the workers' faces was immediate, from suspicion to cautious joy. Maria, the eldest among them, approached Jake with tears in her eyes. "Senor Miller, you understand what this means to us? This is the land of our fathers and their fathers before them." Jake nodded, feeling a peace he'd never known in all his years of gambling and scheming. Father Samuel dismounted slowly, studying Jake with new eyes. "This is an unexpected act of grace, Mr. Miller. But what of you? This could have made you a wealthy man." Jake glanced at Catherine, who smiled encouragingly. "I'm thinking of staying on, Father. These people will need someone to help manage the mine, ensure everything's done right and fair. If you'll have me?" The priest extended his hand, and as Jake grasped it, he felt the last pieces of his old life falling away. The workers began to sing an old Spanish hymn, its melody carrying across the desert as the stars emerged overhead. Catherine slipped her hand into his, and Jake realized that sometimes the greatest wealth comes not from what you take, but from what you give away. The next few months saw the transformation of both the land and its people. The silver mine operated under Jake's careful management, with profits funding both the restoration of the ancient mission and the establishment of a school where Catherine taught the workers' children. The gaming tables of his past held no more allure. He had found something far more valuable than any pot he'd ever won. As winter settled over the desert, Jake stood once again at the mine's entrance, watching Father Samuel conduct a Christmas service in the restored mission. The candlelight spilled through the ancient windows, and the voices of the congregation rose in celebration. Catherine joined him, their young daughter Emma sleeping peacefully in her arms. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Every man gets one chance to make things right," Jake replied, drawing his family close. "I'm just thankful I recognized mine when it came." Above them, the desert stars shone like silver, witnesses to a transformation as profound as the one that had occurred in that harsh land centuries before, when Spanish missionaries first raised a cross in the wilderness and called it holy ground. The years that followed transformed both the mission and the valley around it. Under Jake and Father Samuel's joint stewardship, the silver mine's profits were channeled into restoration projects that preserved the mission's heritage while building a future for the growing community. The old gaming house in Silver City where Jake had won his fateful hand was now a trading post supplying the valley's needs, managed by former miners who'd found honest work more rewarding than the backbreaking labor underground. Catherine's school flourished, drawing families from as far as Tombstone who sought not just education, but the sense of purpose that seemed to emanate from the restored mission's walls. Emma grew into a curious child who would spend hours listening to Father Samuel's stories of the Spanish missionaries, her eyes wide with wonder at tales of their courage and faith. The priest, his hair now streaked with silver, found in her the grandchild he'd never have, teaching her the ancient prayers in both English and Spanish. One spring morning, as Jake supervised the installation of new irrigation channels that would bring water to the mission's expanding gardens, a rider arrived with news that William, the man who'd lost the deed to Jake in that long-ago poker game, had died in Abilene. The letter included a confession. William had known about the silver mine all along, but had been too deep in debt to work it properly. His final words expressed gratitude that the land had found its true purpose under Jake's care. The confession stirred memories Jake had long buried, prompting him to gather the community in the mission's courtyard. There, beneath the desert sun, he formally transferred ownership of the mine and surrounding lands to a trust administered jointly by the church and the workers' families. "This land never truly belonged to any one person," he declared, his voice carrying across the hushed gathering. "It belongs to those who love it and work it with respect for its history." Father Samuel, leaning on his worn walking stick, blessed the document with tears in his eyes. The simple act of signing away what could have been a personal fortune seemed to complete the transformation that had begun that night at the poker table. The old gambler's instincts that had once served Jake so well in reading opponents now helped him read the deeper worth of things: faith, community, and the legacy one leaves behind. As summer approached, the mission hosted its first wedding since its restoration. Thomas, one of the original miners who'd stood with Father Samuel against Jake, married Mary, a young woman who'd come to teach alongside Catherine. Their celebration became a festival that drew people from every settlement between Fort Worth and Silver City, turning the mission's grounds into a vibrant tableau of cultures united in joy. Emma, now 7, led younger children in games through the mission's gardens, their laughter echoing off walls that had once known only silence and decay. Catherine found Jake watching them from the bell tower, his face reflecting the peace he'd found in this unexpected life. "You've given them more than silver," she said, touching his weathered hand. "You've given them roots in something eternal." The mission's bells rang out across the valley every Sunday, calling the faithful to worship and reminding all who heard them of the strange paths grace sometimes takes. Jake's poker winnings, once seen as a curse by some and a blessing by others, had become something far more valuable: the foundation of a community where faith, work, and respect for the land's sacred history flourished together. As the desert stars emerged once again over the mission's crosses, Jake remembered Father Samuel's words from years before about holy ground. The priest had been right, not just about the mission's sanctity, but about the way certain places could transform those who came to them with open hearts. The former gambler had found his redemption not in cards or silver, but in becoming part of something larger than himself, a story that would continue long after the last hand was played. The years that followed saw the mission and its surrounding lands transform in ways none could have predicted. Jake, no longer the restless gambler, but now a respected elder of the community, worked alongside Father Samuel to establish a school within the mission's walls. The old card sharp found an unexpected talent for teaching mathematics to the local children, his former skill with numbers now serving a higher purpose. The silver mine, rather than becoming a source of greed and conflict, operated on a modest scale that sustained rather than exploited the land. Jake had insisted on this approach, remembering the hard lessons of boomtowns he'd seen turn to dust. The workers owned shares in the operation, their families settling into homes built with desert adobe and hope, creating a permanent community where once there had been only transient cowboys and drifters. Sarah, who had first helped Jake understand the true value of the mission's artifacts, became the curator of a small museum housed in one of the restored mission buildings.